Welcome to Nick's Chilling Tales, the place where the eeriest, spine-tingling stories come alive. In today's episode, we'll delve into the haunting experiences of CNAs certified nursing assistants working the late-night shift in nursing homes. These stories, shared by those who've lived them, range from unsettling whispers in empty rooms to heart-pounding encounters with forces beyond explanation. Get ready for 4 real-life accounts that will leave you questioning what might be lurking in the shadows. Dim the lights, grab your favorite blanket, and prepare for a journey into the unknown. Story 1. The Mysterious Nurse in Room 8. I used to work as a CNA in an oncology unit at an old hospital. The building, constructed in 1914, had a storied history. What was once a surgical floor had been converted into the oncology unit after an expansion moved surgeries to the first floor. The place had its quirks, but one thing stood out: Room 8. Something about that room wasn't right. It had a strange pattern. Whenever a patient was about to pass away, the room's light would flicker rapidly, almost like a warning. I brushed it off as superstition at first, but over time I couldn't ignore how often it happened. One night, a patient named Tasha was admitted to Room 8. She was young, battling liver cancer, and in immense pain. I introduced myself, though I already knew her name from the paperwork. She replied curtly, her tone reflecting years of suffering. Around 11 p.m., Tasha finally drifted off to sleep after her medication kicked in. I was stationed at the nurse's desk when the lights in Room 8 began to flicker. My stomach dropped. Suddenly, Tasha's voice rang out from the room, loud and clear. "Roxanne, Roxanne, come back. I need your help." We didn't have a nurse named Roxanne on our floor. Confused but concerned, I hurried to her room. Tasha was sitting on the edge of her bed, struggling to stand. As I helped her, she said something chilling. "That nurse, Roxanne, came in here, played with the light switch, and left." I froze. There was no Roxanne on staff. I got Tasha to the bathroom, holding her arm as she leaned heavily on me. As she sat down, her body suddenly went limp. Her hand still gripped mine tightly, but she wasn't responding. Her face was pale, her eyes wide open but vacant. Tasha had passed away. Later that night, I shared the incident with my supervisor, who revealed an unsettling truth. Years ago, there had been a head nurse on this floor named Roxanne. Known for her dedication, she had passed away from breast cancer in Room 8. Was it a coincidence? Or did Roxanne return to offer comfort to patients in their final moments? Story 2. A Visit from the Past. Working as a home caregiver has its ups and downs, but Judy was one of my favorite clients. A kind elderly woman, she managed most things on her own, but she needed my help at night, especially with bathing. Judy had a history of falls, so I made sure to assist her with her evening routine. Over time, I got to know Judy's story. She had 2 daughters living out of state and a son, Eli, who had tragically passed away at 17 in a motorcycle accident. Her husband, Paul, had died years earlier from Parkinson's disease. Judy lived alone, and despite her cheerful demeanor, you could tell she missed her family deeply. One night, after settling her into bed with a few books, I heard her voice from the hallway. "You promise you won't drink anymore, Paul. Only if you promise." At first, I thought she was talking to herself, but when she called out my name, Pearl, I entered her room. Judy was staring at the side of her bed as though someone were standing there. "Paul's here to take me home," she said matter-of-factly. But I told him we're already home. He's losing his mind again. My heart raced, but I stayed calm, pretending to greet her late husband. I reassured her, then wished them both a good night and left. The next morning, Judy seemed her usual self. But a few days later, I arrived to find her bedridden and weak. Tearfully, she confessed. "Eli came to see me last night. I know you think I'm crazy, but I'm not. Why don't I see my daughters or grandkids? Only Paul and Eli. I think I'm going to die." Judy passed away shortly after from a bacterial infection. Her words have stuck with me. Were those truly hallucinations? Or do our loved ones come to guide us home in our final days? Story 3. The Knocking in Room 217. Working the night shift in a nursing home, you get used to creaky floors and dim hallways. But there's one thing I'll never get used to: Room 217. 2 weeks ago, Mrs. Henderson, the room's resident, passed away. Since then, the room's been empty, but it hasn't felt vacant. While making my rounds one night, I heard a knock. Knock, knock, knock. It came from room 217. My heart pounded, but I told myself it was just the building settling. As I turned to leave, the knocking came again, louder this time. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. The room was cold, the air heavy. Everything seemed in place, except for one thing: the rocking chair by the window. It was moving, slowly back and forth. I bolted from the room and avoided it for the rest of my shift. To this day, I don't know who or what was knocking. The moment my hand touched the chair, my first thought was that the floor might be uneven or that a window had been left open. I tried to stay calm, stepping inside to stop the chair's gentle sway. As soon as I grabbed it, the temperature in the room plummeted. A biting chill seeped through the air, and before I could react, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening thud. I spun around, heart racing, only to see frost crawling up the edges of the door, sealing it shut. My breath hung visibly in the freezing air. Then I heard her voice. "Why did you leave me?" It was faint, raspy, and unmistakably familiar. I froze, my blood running cold. Slowly, as if compelled by some unseen force, I turned back toward the chair. Mrs. Henderson was there, her hollow, tear-streaked eyes locked onto mine. Her pale face was twisted with pain and sorrow. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move as she leaned forward, her voice sharp and accusing. "You all left me," she whispered. "Forgotten." My trembling fingers reached for the call button on the wall. I pressed it repeatedly, but no one came. My back pressed against the frozen door as I stammered, "Mrs. Henderson, I wasn't on shift that night." Her eyes darkened. "That's what they all say." Suddenly, the harsh fluorescent lights flickered on, and I jolted awake. I was still in room 217, where I had been taking a short nap at 3 a.m. After finishing my rounds, the room had been empty ever since Mrs. Henderson passed away. My coworker, Mary, entered moments later, saying she'd seen the call light go off. I must have hit it by accident while sleeping, or so I told myself. The dream had felt too real, her voice, her gaze, the icy chill in the air. It lingered with me, vivid and unsettling. Many of us working the night shift occasionally took naps in unoccupied rooms. Some claimed they'd heard heavy breathing or faint whispers while resting. For me, the line between dream and reality blurred that night, and after what I'd experienced, I stopped napping on shift altogether. Some things are better left undisturbed. Story 4. During the chaos of 2020, the hospital was overwhelmed. Staff shortages led to the hiring of additional personnel for the medical transport team, and I was among them. Our primary role was to assist nurses with repositioning patients, especially those who were critically ill and often required to be placed on their stomachs to aid breathing. But one task loomed over us all: transporting deceased patients to the morgue. The ICU was hit hardest during the crisis. Patients rarely left alive, and the sheer number of deaths meant the hospital's freezer filled quickly. Bodies were stored wherever space could be found, as funeral homes were just as overwhelmed. One night, Tony, my coworker, and I were tasked with transporting a body from room 4 in the ICU. The nurse had already prepared the body, cleaning it and sealing it in a bag. Together, we moved it onto a metal gurney, guiding it toward the elevator that led to the basement morgue. The hospital was old, its walls stained with decades of wear. I avoided the cafeteria, which was eerily close to the morgue, as the proximity always made me uneasy. We rolled the gurney down the dimly lit hallway to the security checkpoint. The guard barely acknowledged us, his AirPods in as he scanned his badge to open the morgue door. Inside, the stark reality of the pandemic was laid bare. White body bags were stacked high, some stained red where fluids had seeped through. The most recent arrivals were near the entrance, but we had to wheel the gurney to the farthest corner to make space. As we positioned the body, the heavy freezer door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the room, and Tony and I froze. A wave of fear washed over us as we exchanged panicked glances. We knew the door could be opened from the inside, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as we banged on the door, yelling for the guard outside. Tony tried calling the hospital operator on his work phone while I fumbled for my personal phone to record the incident. If anything unexplainable happened, I wanted proof. Minutes felt like hours before the door swung open. The security guard stood there, apologetic. He explained that he'd stepped away briefly, thinking we'd already left. Realizing we hadn't signed the paperwork, he returned to find us shouting for help. Relieved but shaken, we finished the necessary documentation. As we closed the freezer door, a whisper echoed from within, "See you soon." We froze. The guard admitted, "That's why I wear AirPods. Sometimes I hear things I shouldn't." Tony and I left the morgue in silence, the weight of what we'd heard heavy on our minds. Later that night, we were called to transport another body, this time from room 8. We insisted the security guard accompany us. Thankfully, the second trip was uneventful, but the unease lingered. The pandemic years of 2020 and 2021 were surreal and harrowing. Death became an almost routine part of life at the hospital. The proximity of the morgue to the kitchen often filled my mind with morbid thoughts, irrational, but persistent. Even now, the memories haunt me, a grim reminder of those dark days. As we close this chapter of chilling tales, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the incredible work of certified nursing assistants, CNAs. You are the backbone of healthcare, often performing the most challenging and thankless tasks with unwavering compassion. Your dedication doesn't go unnoticed. To all the CNAs out there, thank you for your tireless efforts and for being the true front line of care. You are appreciated more than words can express.